Hi, and welcome to this lecture on Introduction to Assessment for courses ADPM 001 and ADP 7001. There are four main learning outcomes for this topic. So after this topic, you should be able to, firstly, define the purposes of assessment, secondly, understand the difference between formative and summative assessment, thirdly, examine the place of assessment in student learning, and fourth, give useful feedback on student work. So what is assessment? There's no one agreed definition of assessment, sadly. That would make it simple. But there are a couple of sample ones that show two different ways of approaching it. Roundtree states that assessment in education can be thought of as occurring whenever one person, in some kind of interaction, direct or indirect, is conscious of obtaining and interpreting information about the knowledge and understanding or abilities of the other person. And Gibbs, in a slightly later definition, says that assessment is a wide range of methods for evaluating pupil performance and attainment, including formal testing and examinations, practical and oral assessment, classroom-based assessment carried out by teachers, and portfolios. So just these two definitions alone provide an interesting set of views about assessment. For Roundtree, assessment is for gaining information for one person about another person. And for Gibbs, assessment is an evaluative tool. So it's not just about assessing, but also about evaluation. So there's something that you do with the information. And both of these tend to assume that the purpose of assessment is solely for the teacher. So if I assess you, the benefit goes to me. But actually there are lots of different ways of defining assessment, and for quite a lot of the ways of defining assessment you could argue that assessment should benefit the student as well. So it could be a way of providing information, but not necessarily just for the teacher. So have a think about what you define as assessment, what assessment is for, what it does, and how it might be carried out. So why do we assess? Students and teachers famously don't always agree on the purposes of assessment, but here are just some possible uses of assessment, and the possible uses might vary depending on your circumstances. Firstly, you might assess to show students how well they're performing. So this relates to what I said before about who is the information for in assessment. You might want to show students relative to each other, but you might not. Again, that will depend on your style as a teacher, and it might depend on what you think is best for your students as well. Sometimes it can be very harmful for a student to know that they're doing worse than everyone in their class, for example, or even to know that they're doing better than everyone in their class. But other times you might want to give a class ranking. For grading and final classification of degrees, that's really important because then it gives the students something to carry away with them. To say, I got first or I got an upper second. This has meaning, and I think if you took that away, students would certainly be very disappointed. They wouldn't feel that their degrees had as much value. An obvious reason, and one that a lot of teachers go to first, is to show staff how well students are performing, so that you can see how your teaching is working and see if there's anything you need to change, perhaps. To show the quality of the course and institution as well. So institutions tend to have a vested interest in how assessment is carried out and how well it makes the institution look, which can sometimes put pressure on teachers. An important reason is to meet students' expectation that there will be assessment, which in a sense kind of sounds like a cycle. Students expect assessment, so we give assessment, and so therefore they expect assessment further down the line. But it is an interesting one. So even though students might moan about assessment, they expect that there'll be some. And if you were to take that away, they might not be as pleased with a lack of assessment as they themselves might predict that they would be. Assessment can motivate students. We'd hope that it's not the only motivation for students, but it can be an important motivation, particularly in subjects where the students don't always enjoy it or don't always find it that thrilling. You can also assess to provide feedback to the students. So it can be you can use formal assessment as just a structure, if you like, within which to provide feedback. so that you have an organised way of making sure everyone gets roughly the same level of feedback. You can assess to help students correct mistakes in their understanding. This is particularly useful in informal assessments, in-class assessments perhaps, or kind of pop quizzes, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page regarding the facts. And similarly, it can show whether students are ready to progress. So if you don't pass your first year of a degree, that means you're not going to do very well in the second year. So you need to work better on getting to grips with those facts in the first year. And that may mean that you go to summer school, or it may mean that you repeat a year again. But ultimately, it's flagging up that you're not ready to progress to the second year if you fail the first year. And finally, it's to have students diagnose their faults and weaknesses. So not just to show them how well they're performing, but also to show how they can improve. And hopefully to give some direction to them on how to improve. And this is something that we'll return to in discussing what makes good quality feedback. So what makes a good assessment? There are 6 objectives here that are generally applicable. But there will also be specific things that you want to achieve whenever you're designing an assessment. So firstly, the assessment should be fit for purpose. So it should achieve the objectives for which you've designed it. And this seems really obvious. Obviously, the assessment should be fit for purpose, but it's just worth thinking about. And even if you haven't designed an assessment, it can be really interesting to kind of say, okay, why was this assessment designed? What was it designed to do? And do I think it's fulfilling that purpose? Even if you don't have the power to change an assessment, it can be useful just to reflect on those issues, because it's surprising how often people just keep an assessment the way it is because it's always been the way it is and because it's uncomfortable to change. An assessment should be reliable, so it would get the same result if repeated in the same circumstances. That's something that's really difficult to measure, but it means it shouldn't be too circumstance dependent. So if it would repeated on the same students of similar ability, it would get the same result. And it should accurately represent the strengths and weaknesses of your students. And again, that's sometimes something you can only think about after the fact. But again, if it's not your assessment, it's still interesting to look at it and go, actually, is this representing the weaknesses and strengths of the students? Or are the students that I think are strong in my subject not doing so well? What strengths and weaknesses is it measuring? And what strengths and weaknesses should it be measuring? Related to that, an assessment should be valid. It should measure what it's supposed to measure. It shouldn't measure students' abilities in something that's not being measured. So in practical terms, this means just actually when you're designing the assessment, thinking about what form the assessment might take, what you might ask in an exam, what do I actually want to measure? Do I want to measure students' ability to draw diagrams or to analyse diagrams? Do I want to measure students' ability to write essays or to respond to literary texts? What is it exactly that I want to measure? The principles on which students are assessed should be as objective as possible. This is actually quite difficult to guarantee, particularly in humanities subjects where you have a lot of written essays, and what makes a good essay can be really subjective. People have different opinions on it. And in some senses you can't correct for that entirely. But you can make the mark scheme clear if you have that power. You can make the questions as clear as you possibly can. And it's just a useful objective to have in mind. Again, even if you don't necessarily have a choice on these things, you can think about, well, are the assessments that objective, or are they completely subjective or opinion-based? Is the difference between a first and an upper second very good and excellent? Those are incredibly subjective things, for example. So it should be relevant as well. The assessment should assess qualities that are relevant to the course and its learning outcomes. So if one of your learning outcomes is students will be able to draw neat diagrams within a limited time range, then they should be assessed on that, not on their ability to analyse diagrams, unless that's also one of the learning outcomes. And again, it's surprising how often this is not the case, and you find students undertaking assessment that they didn't really know they were supposed to learn, and that assess the skills that they may or may not have, but that they didn't learn in the course. And finally, and very importantly, it should be clear. So what you have to do to pass the assessment should be clear to the students, because otherwise assessment is just done by chance, it's not reliable, it's not valid, and it's not fit for purpose. So clarity is really important. And again, that's something you can do something about even if you haven't designed the assessment, is try and make it as clear to students as possible what to do to pass. And if it's not clear to you as a teacher what students should do to pass, then that's a problem with the assessment, and that's something that you can reflect on. So there are a few different types of assessment, some more common than others. There's a contrast, one of the most important contrasts is between formative and summative assessment. So formative assessment is usually undertaken during learning, it's designed to help students improve, and one example might be a test taken in the middle of a module, so it would test students' knowledge so far. And the feedback to the students would be letting them know how well they've done in certain areas, what they need to work on, and what they don't necessarily need to work on so much. Summative assessment, by contrast, is done after learning, and so it's designed to provide information on how a student has done. So that might be assessment at the end of a module. Now, it's very difficult to tell sometimes whether assessment is formative or summative, or in fact both. So assessment can be formative and summative at the same time. So it might be an end module assessment, which seems summative, this is how you've done on this module, but it also will be formative in the sense that it shows the student how they're doing on the degree in more general terms, so perhaps how they're doing on a particular skill, a particular type of literary text, or a particular aspect or subdiscipline. So things can be formative and summative at the same time. So I find people getting in a tears about, oh, whether is this formative or is this summative? As long as you know what the two are, it can be both at the same time. That's completely normal. So the other three are sort of ways of judging assessment. So criterion-based assesses on specified criteria such as skills, knowledge or behaviour, and students are assessed on how well they meet criteria, and they might meet criteria at different levels, and that's how we assess in the PGCAP and SILT modules. You may remember I've given you a lot of information about the assessment criteria for the two assignments for this module and talked about the levels at which you might meet criteria. That's because this is criterion-based assessment. Another way that you can assess students is norm-based assessment. So that's when students' work is judged in relation to the rest of the class. So it might be decided beforehand that 60% of the class will pass, 40% of the class will fail. And so the student's grade therefore depends on how well they've done in relation to the norm. This is often done in the US, and it's known as grading on a curve. So you kind of know in advance roughly how many people will get A's, B's and C's. And this is one that people often debate the fairness of. Is it fair that in a year where everyone is clever, for example, you're less likely to do well? Because it will be norm-based and it will depend on how well everyone else does. But it could also be said to be fairer, so if you get a harder paper in a particular year, because that does happen, some years a paper is easy, some years a paper is hard. If you get a hard paper one year, then that kind of compensates for that a bit because everyone will do slightly worse, but the curve will stay the same. There's ipsative assessment, which is less common but a very interesting way of thinking about assessment. So work is only judged by comparison to a student's own earlier work, and the mark is based on how much the student has improved from before. This is quite self-referential and quite time-consuming, but incredibly valuable to students. It's not something we tend to use in university because often external forces demand that we give certain grades, so we can't say, oh, a student just improved in comparison to her own work. So that's really great because they need to know how well a student's going to do in comparison to the other 100 people who are applying for the same job. So they want to know a less self-referential level of achievement, but it can be a very interesting way, just even if you don't do it, of thinking about assessment. Particularly in kind of earlier stages of a degree where the focus might be on kind of improving people and making sure they have development goals rather than judging on how well they're doing.